My name is Sarita Malik. I am Professor of Media and Culture here at Brunel University, and I'm also the Associate Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research Impact. Culture wars are battles between authoritarians and libertarians over what should constitute the behavioural norms of society. Well, in America, these have been fought largely between the religious right and secular liberals. In Britain, dividing lines are just as likely to be over attitudes to the monarchy, social class, and national identity, including the rise of Englishness. So it's fitting that today, on St George's Day, and with the London mayoral election looming, that we unpack some of the increased potency of culture wars. Speaking about the culture wars, for many of us, is a complex exercise. On the one hand, to pay attention to something that feels already amplified and indeed weaponised can make one feel complicit in fanning the flames, the risk that we are also actively culture warring. On the other hand, the culture wars have real socio-political effects. And I say this on the day that the government's Rwanda bill to deport asylum seekers has passed Parliament and is set to become law. The culture wars, what they are, how they operate in society, and what implications this has for us here in the UK and more globally, therefore requires our critical attention, and that's very much the focus of this evening. We're going to begin with a lecture from Professor Nick Hubble, followed by a panel discussion with experts across different so-called battlegrounds of culture wars, and finally move to questions and answers. So I would really like to encourage you to all think about questions that you might want to ask the panel later on in the evening. A very quick housekeeping announcement. No tests are expected this evening, but in the event that an alarm does sound, please calmly follow our stewards out of the building to the meeting area. So we're going to start with Professor Nick Hubble, who is Professor of Modern and Contemporary English at Brunel. They are the co-editor of the BCCW's Decades book series, published by Bloomsbury. Nick's other books include Mass Observation in Everyday Life, The Proletarian Answer to the Modernist Question, and Growing Old with the Welfare State. They currently hold a very prestigious Leverhulme Research Fellowship to investigate self-reflexivity, class consciousness, culture wars, and social change in Britain. So a real expert on the issues that we're going to be discussing. From this project, Nick is well placed to provide the historical context and set the scene for the current and possible future scenarios in culture wars. I'd like to welcome Nick.
Thank you. Right, so here we are on St George's Day, and the St George I think about in relation to England is George Orwell. So let's move on to George Orwell. You don't have to read all of that, it's just an example of Orwell writing about England. In the 1990s, I was interested in the English radical tradition, represented by people like Orwell, as the basis for a new confident cultural consciousness within Britain. Therefore, I researched and wrote a PhD on him and social change in England at the beginning of the Second World War. I mean, as you can see in The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell claimed that a revolution had taken place and that a new form of English life was spreading along the concrete roads and the naked democracy of the swimming pools in Slough and Hayes and Uxbridge. He didn't actually say Uxbridge, but he certainly knew this area very well. It was one of the areas he was talking about. These were the social changes that led a few years later to the 1945 Labour landslide victory and the establishment of the welfare state. It seemed to me at the time that something similar was possible in the second half of the 90s with the rising support for New Labour and their promise to focus on the forgotten suburbs and young working families. When I started my PhD part-time in 1996, I had 2 children under the age of 4, and my wife, who is German, was also doing a PhD part-time, and we were both working part-time. it was hard, but there was a sense of optimism for the future to come. On the evening of the day of the 1997 general election, we went to an election party, and soon after the polls closed, Birmingham Edgbaston declared their result, and the winner was the Labour MP, Gisela Stewart, if you give her German pronunciation of her name. And she got up and made a speech. And at this party, a man who was actually standing next to my wife shouted out, "She's a," expletive deleted, "German," much to the embarrassment of the hostess of this party. And of course, I mean, this is a memory that comes back to me many times, and it's kind of heightened by the fact that Gisela Stewart went on to be a very leading campaigner for Brexit and was the chair of the Vote Leave kind of movement. At the time, we just laughed this off, and I went on pursuing my ideas of radical English possibilities through a series of conferences on Englishness in the early 2000s. However, I kept running up against two basic problems. One problem was that lots of progressive people I spoke to just were simply not interested in Englishness in any way, shape or form. And the other problem was whenever I was at these conferences, it always ran into somebody or other who would say something negative about Europe. If we're going to join Europe or something, and then this is at a point where, we joined the EU in 1973, and as a matter of fact, geographically, of course, Britain has always been part of Europe. So I kind of got fed up with Englishness and stopped doing that and moved on to other research interests. I lost interest in Englishness, but it didn't lose interest in me. It continued to grow as a point of identification, becoming what the academics Ailsa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones describe as the motor force behind the remaking of British politics over the last decade. In particular, Englishness lay at the heart of the decision to leave the EU. Now, I promise I'm not going to linger on Brexit, but it's impossible to understand the culture wars in the UK, and in particular in England, without thinking about Brexit. Like an estimated 90% of academics in the UK, I voted to remain. Not only did we lose the referendum, but we got called the metropolitan elite and described as rootless anywheres rather than authentic somewheres. Or, as Theresa May put it, I was a citizen of nowhere. From the press, I found out that I'd been living in a bubble with people who all thought the same as me, which was, very weird because I knew a lot of people who did vote leave. My best friend in academia did vote leave. So did my dad and a number of my close relatives. So did half of the friends I still have from school. So did other friends we have. So did parents of my youngest son's school friends, and so on and so on. And that's because basically people don't live in bubbles. Not in the UK. There are not very many people at all who live in a bubble. So it's just nonsense made up by the press. Nor, I should add, have I irrevocably fallen out with or stopped talking to any of these people. Why would I? It's not that I hadn't always been aware that I thought and felt differently about certain things than them. Like most people with a high level of education who come from a background of a family with a relatively low level of formal education, I've learnt to negotiate two sets of what sociologists now call feeling rules. Even so, what happened in 2016 and afterwards was both a shock and not easily comprehended. It made me turn to the map to try and work out and understand what had happened. There were only 3 regions in the UK, and we know which voted in favour of Remain. Northern Ireland, Scotland and London, although of course Hillingdon was one of the 5 boroughs that actually voted to leave. One might think, I should say actually, the vote in Wales was very close. It was only about 70,000 people that voted, that tipped Wales over into leave. So therefore, the actual vote to take us outside of the UK was the English vote outside London. More precisely, as it says here, 85% of those who identified as English, not British, were leavers, as were fully 2/3 of the people who feel more English than British. By contrast, over 60% of those in England emphasising a British identity supported Remain. One might think, OK, those in Britain who identify as British tended to vote Remain, while nationalists tended to vote leave, but that wasn't the case either. Because in Scotland, Remain became associated with support for Scottish independence. In Wales, as we can see, you possibly can't see, but the data's a bit small, but I'll summarise, it's a little bit more complicated because a significant proportion of the population just consider themselves to be English anyway. But voters who identify as primarily Welsh voted predominantly to Remain, and then you see that large yellow chunk of the Welsh-speaking heartlands of Ceredigion and Gwynedd. While those who identified as British tended the other way, with those identifying as English in Wales overwhelmingly voting to leave. In other words, the vote to leave the UK was driven by English-identified voters in England and Wales and British-identified voters in Scotland and Wales. For Londoners or others in England who think of themselves predominantly or exclusively British, your views do not align with those of the predominantly or exclusively British in Scotland or Wales. Your views are actually closer to the views of those who feel predominantly or exclusively Scottish or Welsh. The interesting thing, though, about Englishness is it doesn't function like Scottishness or Welshness, in that by and large it's not expressed through support for national parties and independence. Rather, as Henderson and Wynne-Jones point out, it's expressed by support for institutions, symbols and values such as the monarchy and the NHS. Now, these are British institutions, but they're viewed by those who ascribe to a sense of English identity as theirs, as English in all but name. In other words, those voters who identify as English are happy with an England-dominated Britain, a Britain that's dominated by England, the way it is. Therefore, they want the current parliamentary version of Britain to carry on as it is. This was the sovereignty that the English voted for in 2016, I found myself thinking, and it was the expression of a particular kind of culture war, a deep historical culture war, not the shallow one of the clickbait headlines. I mean, these are all around us. So these are just from the last month. So from the left, you've got The Guardian saying the war on universities is a culture war. In the centre, the Financial Times proclaims that we can end the culture war because a recent report, Finding a Balance, by the think tank More in Common, found that there was a widespread support by a ratio of 5 to 1 amongst the British public for equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives. Finally, on the right, we have an opinion piece from the Times proclaiming the rise of culturenomics, which is a term for cultural debates which have an embedded economic cost. So, for example, 80% of Britons believe that climate change is happening, but once the issue is framed in economic terms, who pays for implementing net zero, it suddenly becomes a much more divisive debate, and that's why there's been a sort of rise in support for delaying or abandoning meeting that target. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen articles of this sort framed in terms of the culture war. Culture wars, however, did rise to prominence very quickly after that point. According to researchers from King's College London, newspaper articles focusing on the existence or nature of culture wars in the UK rose from just 21 in 2015 to 534 in 2024. The right-wing press, seeing the left as overstating the existence of culture wars in its obsession with identity, while the left-leaning press tends to depict the right, including the current government and Prime Minister, as weaponising cultural issues in order to distract attention away from the woeful economic state of the country. And these tweets are from the Telegraph and the Mail this year, just showing the sort of random nature of stories that they can attach culture war to. However, despite the fact that left and right view culture wars from a different perspective, it's fair to say that overall British public opinion is still fairly sceptical. The fact that in America, culture wars seem to revolve around evangelical Christian issues and hot-button topics such as abortion, which are not significant factors in the UK, leads some to suggest that any idea of a culture war must necessarily be an input from the US that should be best avoided. But that's actually easier said than done, because culture wars aren't only over race, abortion and evangelical Christianity as in the US, there are different issues that have triggered these kinds of divides in the UK, such as Brexit and Scottish independence. Nevertheless, in Britain, the traditional approach has been, where possible, to politely ignore such social and cultural divisions and brush them under the carpet when no one is looking. No culture wars, please, we're British. The textual equivalent of trying to brush an inconvenient truth under the carpet is to place quote marks around it. We don't have culture wars, we have culture wars, which are something underhand that the other side is doing. In 2021, the already mentioned think tank, More in Common, published a whole report, Dousing the Flames, explaining why culture wars are un-British. Because we have peaceful agreement in Britain. We don't have troublesome protests like on the continent. Because culture wars are in large part an American concept, and because when we asked Britons what they thought most summed up Britishness, they said queuing. I must admit that when I read this report in the course of my research, it was with some disbelief at both how simplistic this argument was and how much it replicated what is called British exceptionalism, the idea that Britain is inherently different to other countries in terms of being uniquely balanced and therefore more inclined to compromise. The highlighting of queuing in particular is both bizarre, because it's not true that people don't queue elsewhere, and also problematic in that it suggests the role of British people is to wait patiently while, in the words of the report, Britain's leaders act as the stewards of cultural change in Britain. But that isn't the story of cultural and social change in Britain. Changes in people's lives, from votes to women to paid holidays, were not by and large dispensed by benign leaders in a judicious manner, but gained by people themselves through vigorous debate, campaigns and struggle. Moreover, the story even in the 1930s is of people trying to develop their own lifestyles for themselves, as Orwell said, along the concrete roads and naked democracy of the swimming pools. Today, the right-wing press would describe those campaigns and that behaviour possibly as culture wars being fought by people with no connection to the wider British public, who will be described as content with Victorian conditions. In other words, complaining about culture wars is itself a form of culture war in some respects. Let me give another example of that. So here we have some books by Matthew Goodwin and David Goodhart, names that anyone who looks at the politics shelves in their local Waterstones will be familiar with. Both push a similar argument, that a new graduate elite are responsible for imposing double liberalism, that's social liberalism and economic liberalism, on an unwilling British public. Audaciously, Goodwin claims that the rise of this elite takeover can be dated from 4th of May 1979, with Margaret Thatcher introducing economic liberalism, which was reinforced in 1997 by Tony Blair and compounded by his unleashing of radical cultural liberalism. Leaving aside the fact that Blair, who advocated compulsory homework, ASBOs, argued that rights were dependent on responsibilities, wasn't actually all that culturally liberal. You know, the idea is just sort of ridiculous anyway, because it's not the same people weren't pushing economic liberalism as were pushing social liberalism. In fact, the idea of a new graduate elite imposing liberalism from top down was originally an American neoconservative idea from the 1960s. So it's not new, it's just something that's been pulled back out of history and sort of dusted off and used again. And what you have in these books is Goodwin and Goodhart both arguing to some extent that the reason culture wars are happening now is because it's a response to, you know, this new graduate elite imposing their values over the last decade. And this is kind of, you know, it's therefore forced sort of people to resist against it. In fact, they argue that this imposition of elite values has created a backlash. David Goodhart actually even defines backlash as something that naturally occurs. You know, if you push people too far, a certain number of them will become violent and angrily resist it. And according to him, that means that you've actually gone too far and you should row back and you know, take that into account as though it's a kind of natural feedback route and not just people, you know, being violent and hateful for the sake of it. Now, like everyone else, I've spent the last 10 years trying to make sense of what is happening around me as Britain has gone through a series of bewildering political and social convulsions. I finally come to the conclusion that yes, we are living through a culture war, but not this shallow clickbait idea of culture war in the media, but rather a deeper, more historical form of the culture war specific to Britain and to England in particular. However, because we like to pretend that we don't have culture wars in Britain, it's necessary to first have a look at America, where there is an acknowledged and to some extent agreed history of the culture wars, so that we can see what such a history looks like. Now, the term culture wars began appearing in the US press in the late 1980s. It became fully established following the publication of the sociologist James Davison Hunter's 1991 book, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. The idea of culture wars was quickly cemented in politics by a speech by Pat Buchanan at the 1992 Republican National Convention, in which he proclaimed, "There is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself." Now, Buchanan had previously been Ronald Reagan's communications director during the 1980s, and before that he had worked as a speechwriter for Nixon during the 1960s and 1970s, during which time he coined the phrase silent majority. The idea that there is a large mass of people who keep quiet but who have a deep moral attachment to conservative social norms, which remains the model used by conservative politicians for claiming that they enjoy popular support when they have got no other means of actually proving that they have this popular support. It's fitting that this term from the 1960s is still around because the origin of the culture wars which came to dominate American society lies in the 1960s, when the counterculture and the student new left changed America and American culture in what can be understood as a social revolution, led by a new generation not content to live in the same way as their parents had. The result was not just an explosion of popular culture, Woodstock, etc., but movements, Black and Chicano power, women's and gay liberation, and the establishment in the universities of influential programs for Black studies, Chicano studies, ethnic studies, and women's studies. As the historian Andrew Hartman argues, the identity-based movements of the 60s underscored new forms of knowledge and created new ideas. Identity was something to be stressed. It was something to grow into or become, and thereby liberate oneself from discriminatory cultural norms. In this respect, the 1960s created a new structure of feeling. A lot of people who talk disparagingly about identity politics don't understand the emotional satisfaction and fulfillment involved of being able to grow fully into yourself. These ideas of self-discovery and self-actualization were popular and quickly merged with existing social democratic traditions in society and could be seen as already winning the culture wars by the 1990s, if you could use the term win. The term actually exploded into popular consciousness through the authoritarian Christian right trying to fight back against that secular liberalisation of America. Feminism was arguably the most successful of these movements, upending gender roles which have been seen as straightforward matters of fact. These were not the values of a metropolitan elite imposed upon an unwilling silent majority. Millions of ordinary Americans had come to terms with the legacies of feminism, the sexual revolution, and a more expansive sense of identity, and had come to see those who opposed such changes as reactionaries who stood outside the American mainstream. In fact, and this is important in comparing the experience of the UK with that of the US, the exceptional state when values were passed down from the top was the normative post-war America from 1945 to 1963. Hartman, who's the historian of the culture wars, characterises normative Americans as those who prized hard work, personal responsibility, individual merit. They lived to stringent sexual expectations. Sex was confined to the parameters of heterosexual marriage. Normative Americans believed in ways consistent with strict gender roles, without men worked inside the home and women cared for children inside it, normative Americans believed their nation was the best in human history. This conformist period of history was characterised by the strict adherence to rigid social norms, social solidarity, full male employment and rising living standards. It was seen in some quarters as a golden age, and remains as such in the nostalgic remembrances of many. While the new social movements of the 1960s challenged the old social norms, new economic conditions, exacerbated by the 1973 oil crisis and subsequent recessions, put paid to both full employment and rising living standards. The attraction of the Christian right in this context to those unprepared to embrace the possibilities of the new social movements and a more fluid sense of identity was it provided an alternative structure of feeling reminiscent of that golden age of normative America. In other words, it allowed people to feel the same way about themselves as they had in the immediate post-war decades. Because in the community of the church, the American church, the social solidarity and traditional gender roles could be maintained, and subsequent generations, children and grandchildren, could be brought up in the same milieu. Hence, you end up with a society with a clash between two opposed and entrenched cultures, motivated by completely different moral versions of what good life is, and governed by very different feeding rules. So that's the history of the culture wars in America. As I've already said, cultural division in Britain does not revolve around the church or related topics like abortion. Nevertheless, there are many parallels between the UK and the US. In exactly the same post-war decades, up until the same year, 1963, there's even a very famous poem by Philip Larkin about that. 1963 was the year sexual intercourse began. Up until that point, there was a conformist normative Britain characterised by social solidarity, fairly traditional gender roles, universal male employment, and rising living standards. But we also had a social revolution in the 60s which changed social life in Britain very rapidly. Again, as in the US, feminism was probably the most successful social movement in terms of how extensively it has transformed gender roles in Britain. This social revolution was not imposed from above, but is in response to not just young people's demands for a better, more fulfilling life, but also to their parents' desire for their kids to have more opportunities than they themselves had. Therefore, the Robbins Report, published in 1963, recommended the expansion of the universities, and then 2 years later, in 1965, a government white paper made comprehensive schooling into the national policy. As someone who was born in 1965, I'm certainly glad of both of those developments, because my parents left school at 15 and 16, respectively, but I was able to stay on to the sixth form at my comprehensive and then eventually do my undergraduate degree at Essex, my postgraduate degrees at Sussex, both of them 1960s plate clerks, universities founded as a result of the Robin Report, and then for the last 17 years I've taught in this one here, which is another 1960s university. We tend to think of the culture wars as people tweeting nasty comments at each other, but the actual nuts and bolts of it are government reports and papers and arguments and the building of education systems and you know, it's a longer historical process. The 1960s severed the remaining causal connection between class and educational achievement, at least to some extent, for a while. Despite the famous comedy sketch featuring John Cleese and the two Ronnies, no one had to know their place anymore. In the words of the historian John Lawrence, a shift in the worldview of the British working class from habit to self-reflection became dominant from the 1960s onwards. As a consequence, many people wanted to move beyond traditional social norms and live freer and more emotionally fulfilling social lifestyles. The 1970s was a volatile decade, both politically and socially. But when I started at my local comprehensive in 1976, Britain was the most socially equal country in the world, according to some metrics. Of course, that didn't last that long. During her 11 years in power, Margaret Thatcher's proclamations of the virtue of traditional Victorian values was a cultural war response to the new post-1960s culture, which had emerged from the straitjacket of normative Britain. As was her declaration that there's no such thing as society, there are individual men and women and families, implying that people should be self-reliant and not look to the government or the welfare state to support them. Folk wisdom has it that Thatcher won the economic argument, but the left won the cultural war. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the upshot was, as in the US, but by the 1990s, it was clear that the new identities that had emerged in the 1960s were not going away. In the US, the churches and the Republican Party provided a traditional structure of feeling to support those opposed to the new social movements. In Britain, this wasn't an option, so we might expect cultural division to have disappeared, swept under the carpet by sort of vague liberalism, which is perhaps what appeared to be the case during the late 1990s and early 2000s, but then they returned as if from nowhere in 2016. What happened in the meantime? Well, I can tell you on St George's Day, Englishness happened. According to Henderson and Wynne Jones, in 1992, people in England described themselves as British rather than English by a ratio of 2-to-1. So about a third of people said they were English. By 2011, people in England were more likely to describe themselves as English. So in less than 20 years, the English proportion went from about a third to over half, to a majority. Repeated survey evidence shows that this is an enduring change and that Englishness is here and here to stay. The result is that there is an available structure of feeling now to support those who want to align themselves with the traditional values that characterise the normative Britain of the immediate post-war decades. English identifiers are more likely to cite the monarch literature, sacrifices in world wars and countryside, whereas British identifiers are more likely to be proud of openness to other cultures and faiths, as well as the shared institutions such as the NHS. The result, outside the big cities, is a small c conservative culture which values a traditional English way of life and supports a law and order approach to maintain that status quo, which would include economic stability as well. Therefore, in this respect, the UK is actually very similar to the US, apart from the fact that this structure of feeling is neither tied to the church nor is directly to a political party, as is the case with the Republican Party in the States. As a consequence, English identifiers are not completely resistant to social change, and we don't get the culture wars at the same polarised intensity as in the US. But there is still a difference between people's emotional identities which we ignore at our peril. And now, as I'm kind of heading towards a conclusion, in 2022, in the 39th annual report of the British Social Attitudes Survey, which was subtitled Culture Wars, Keeping the Brexit Divide Alive, the authors noted that Leavers and Remainers diverge on culture war issues in line with what they, the authors, consider to be authoritarian, socially conservative, and libertarian, socially liberal outlooks. They consider a wide range of data before concluding that there does appear to be a potential for culture war issues to maintain the electoral division between Remainers and Leavers that is central to how people voted in the 2019 general election. Therefore, people are going to continue to try and do that, politicians, because it seems possible to do so according to the data. However, the authors of this report went on to note that the one thing that might stop that election result being endlessly repeatable forever is because the divide between libertarian and authoritarian outlooks, there's a long-term trend towards liberalisation across the board. In fact, in the more recent, I'm going to skip over what John Curtis says there, but in the more recent 40th report, which came out last year, September 23, the headline data showed quite sweeping liberalisation over that period. So, for example, a couple to live together before marriage is now supported by 81% rather than 64% in '94. 67% think a same-sex relationship is never wrong, compared with 17% in 1983. That's a huge shift. Similarly, 76% now think it's a completely a woman's right to choose abortion, up from 37% in 1983. That's another huge social shift. However, there's one reason which gives John Curtis, who's actually the author of that part of the report, cause to argue that it would be a mistake to think that Britain will simply continue to become more liberal. And is that the data shows that government pressure in alignment with the media has managed to impinge on public support for trans rights. The report summarises how attitudes towards people who are transgender have become markedly less liberal over the past 3 years. So since, in 2019, 82% of people describe themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender. In 3 years, that went down to 64%. In 2019, 53% of people said that someone should be able to have the sex on their birth certificate changed. That's gone down over 3 years to 30%. While women, younger people, the more educated and less religious, express more liberal views towards people who are transgender, these views have declined across all demographic groups. However, it's still the case that 71% of women describe themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender, compared with 57% of men. I mean, the first thing to say is that these figures are still much, much more supportive than anything you will ever read in the media, and that should be borne in mind. However, as the author of this report argues, these changes in attitudes are substantial, and their direction and timing suggest that they have been largely triggered by the intense political debate and media discussion on both sides of the border regarding the easing of the circumstances in which someone can be diagnosed as transgender. By both sides of the border, it's referring to the act of the UK government to stop user Section 35 order to overrule the Scottish Gender Recognition Bill of 2022. This had the double appeal to social conservatives of being anti-Scottish and reinforcing traditional binary sex essentialism. The author of the report goes on to argue that we may be seeing a period effect similar to that which we witnessed in the 1980s for attitudes to homosexual relationships, with the emergence of AIDS and the introduction of Section 28, which you'll remember was a ban of the so-called promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and in schools. When those things were brought in 1988, it lowered the support, British support for same-sex relationships to 10%, which is the lowest level it's ever been. As I said, it's now back up to 67%. What this shows is that government, sustained government action can have an effect on social attitudes, and it almost looks as though the current government, like the Thatcherite government, actually, use these powers to advocate a self-conscious reactionary identity as part of their political appeal to voters. So in this respect, the culture war in the UK is returning in a circle to the Thatcherite position of validating repressive authoritarian government to enforce a normative Britain. However, that didn't work then, and the current Conservative government is so weak and unstable that it's unlikely to work now. At least it's unlikely to work in their favour, anyway. So, okay, I've got one more slide, which is a very quick conclusion, which is what can we expect in the near future? Well, we can expect more political chaos, I'm afraid to say, because the election campaign has already started and it's just going to be completely crazy until that's resumed. Despite this report that appeared at the weekend saying UK voters are frustrated with politicians employing desperate culture war tactics, we probably are going to see more superficial culture wars, certainly in the media, because that seems to be the kind of clickbait policy of certainly of the Murdoch press. We are going to also see more books on England. We've got two examples here. Caroline Lucas's Another England, which came out a couple of days ago, and Tom Baldwin and Mark Steers. Tom Baldwin is the biographer of Keir Starmer, if you don't know who he is. That book is coming out, I think, tomorrow or the day after, so they're both coming out for St George's Day, if you like. Both attempts trying to rewrite the story of England, a bit like George Orwell was trying to do in 1941, and give us a more progressive version, because I think it has finally got through to the left that this is a kind of necessary activity to do. But finally, there's going to be more social change and the continuation of the deeper historical culture war. Because the 1960s revolution hasn't run its course yet. People are still finding freer and more satisfying ways to live. The continuing growth of English identification as a means of maintaining the structural feeling of a traditional English way of life is itself an ongoing reaction to this ongoing social change. These two emotional realities are going to continue evolving in tandem, and it makes no sense to sweep that under the carpet. Much better for us to appreciate what's going on and try and find ways of talking to each other than to imagine it can just be kind of magically waved away. Okay, thank you very much. I've got some contact points there as well.
Great. Thank you, Nick, so much. That was incredibly informative. I think you'll agree with me, and it really sets the tone for the panel discussion that we're going to have now. And I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for all of us to pick up on some of the points that Nick's raised in setting and setting the scene for us around culture wars. So if I can please invite our four panellists to come up and have a chat. Okay, so our four panellists are each going to speak for a few minutes, offering their take on the culture war phenomena, and then we're going to open it up to discussion before we have a drink around 7:15. So I'll introduce each of you and then give you an opportunity to speak, and then I'll move on to the next person. So starting with Anita. Anita Howarth is a senior lecturer at Brunel, specialising in the interaction between journalism, media, politics and risk. She has a particular interest in how traditional and social media engage with existing policies on social justice and injustice in ways that legitimise or challenge, resist or disrupt dominant perspectives. So Anita, we'd love to hear your take on the culture wars for the next few minutes.
Okay, I want to talk briefly about media and migration in the context of culture wars. And I want to focus specifically on the political actors who weaponize hate and the culture wars for political gain. I'm not looking specifically at those who believe or hold dearly to some of these views. But just before I get into grounding it in the more concrete, the theoretical approach I'm taking is about representations, aesthetic approaches to representation, where representation is not a mirror reflection of what's spoken or captured. So a photograph does not provide a mirror reflection of the reality, but is a representation of it, shaped by how it was composed, how it's interpreted. And the aesthetic approach refers to a study of taste, and more specifically what I'm looking at in the book I'm working on is an aesthetic approach to both beauty and ugliness. Now you might think, what has this got to do with migration? But we understand what the aesthetic approach to representation does is it raises attention or draws our ways of thinking to how people orientate themselves to what they reject and what they value, and what emotions or affective sensibilities that arises. In other words, what we see in the culture wars around migration is very intense, very often vitriolic debates. So that's where I'm locating it. But that's taking it in quite an abstract level, and I'll bring those themes through. What I want to ground it in a little bit more specificity is I thought, Baroness Wolsey summed up the particular nature of media and migration debates at the moment when she said, she referred to certain senior figures in the Conservative Party operating a form of politics that is not about fixing things, but breaking them. It's not about bringing Britain's diverse communities together, but turning them against each other. So the question for me then is, when that translates into media, what are we talking about? Has an old front in cultural wars widened, one where the journalistic practices are actually now incentivizing the kind of politics that Wolsey is talking about? Or are we also looking at a new front in culture wars, one that, for instance, is waged through AI-generated images? We can't see the one without the other. So what do I mean when I say new wine in old wineskins? That's a biblical metaphor where, I forget where it comes from, but if you put new wine in old wineskins, the old wineskins split. My question is whether journalism, as it's been practiced since the 1850s, actually has the skills or tools to respond to what's happening now. And I think this needs some fundamental question because they're being played. So we see this, for instance, in Braverman's comments about a hurricane of mass migration and an invasion of migrants holding values which are at odds with our own. There is some kind of construction of them out there and us over here. We see it also in Rishi Sunak's way of endorsing and pushing through a Rwanda bill, and his justifications for it, perhaps not expressed as crudely as she is. Presented with that language and that kind of representation, journalists have a choice. How do they report that? Traditionally, journalists would have reported it on the basis of a combination of, is the source credible and is the source important? But when you have politicians who are routinely lying, routinely taking statistics and misrepresenting them or ignoring them or fabricating them, they get called out by the ONS, the Official of National Statistics, and they carry on doing it. And they happen to be senior ministers, including the Prime Minister. What is the response of journalists? And journalists are doing the same thing as they did with Johnson and Trump. They're going with who's more important than who is a credible source. They don't have to repeat those quotes, but they have. And this is not just the tabloids. The mainstream newspapers are doing it as well. My question is, they need to rethink that. Because what we're seeing in people like Braverman and Jenrick and others on that part of the party and government is a total lack of remorse or shamelessness at lie. There was a time when a Prime Minister or a Home Secretary called out for falsifying statistics in Parliament would have been shamed. There is no shame now. So what do the journalists do? There's no answer. So what is happening is there's a liar's dividend. And that liar's dividend means that the politicians like Braverman, who I note has not, at the time I saw it, yet commented on the passing of the Rwanda bill, the politicians are benefiting from the repetition of that quote. Not just when they say it in the first instance, but when journalists go and give a right to reply to people on the other side. And then a debate over it. So over and over and over again, the false information is being repeated. And you ask most people, they will remember what is repeated more than they will remember what was refuted. So they need to think, I think journalism as a profession needs to rethink that. The second issue, and I'm flipping this because I think we can't understand just one side of the media and not the social media as well. My question is also about how the debates about AI-generated images are coming in here. Why am I bringing it in? Because it's feeding off those debates that Braverman, Sunak and others are fostering. It's responding to them, it's driving it, it's giving it some of its animating energy. And much of the debate, as with fake news, deepfakes, has focused on ones that approximate documentary photographs. So, will I be able to believe what I see when AI is dominated? Do I have to rush?
A little bit.
Okay. But lurking in the question is whether this is the overtly artistic forms. So they're not attempting, they're not pretending to be photographic form. If we look at it in the populist, within the radical right on social media, we see images like this. What they're doing is they're drawing on long-running tropes that they've used in photographic forms, very often recaptured, reappropriated, photoshopped, shall we say altered rather than photoshopped. And they're using the same ones. The migrant male is a brown-skilled, threatening, angry man. They create this one, for instance. Outnumbered, the loss of women's freedoms, the oppression. They're drawing on very, very primal stereotypes. And this is particularly evocative because Rochdale was, or is, for significant parts of the population, synonymous with grooming gangs. So what they're doing here is creating this idea of the violent, predatory men that are coming in. This is a politics of fear. It's a politics of provocation. But we make a mistake if we only look at that side. There is also an agenda of resistance. We see it, for instance, in this example of Manus Island and Nauru. Okay. Those were two islands that were used as detention centres off the coast of Australia for migrants crossing in boats. Horrendous conditions. The lawyers created from the testimonies voices about what had happened there, used AI images to capture it. But crucially here, the experiences they depicted were real. They were backed by testimonies given to lawyers preparing a legal case. Not all is serious. We've got the satire coming through, the mocking of and the ridiculing of politicians by repositioning privilege as refugees and key workers. So there is a move between the demonizing and the challenging. As I said, the aesthetic approach is about the values we reject, and aesthetic approach is about what we value and what we reject. We see that playing out in the AI-generated images. We see the tropes that have run through playing out. I'll stop there before Sarita. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jasbinder S. Nijjar is a lecturer in social sciences at Brunel. His work examines the relationship between institutional racism and militarised policing in Britain. His forthcoming book, The Racial Politics of Police Warfare, is due to be published by Manchester University Press. Jasbinder is also on the Council of Management of the Institute of Race Relations and a trustee of the monitoring group, two leading anti-racism charities in Britain.
As already mentioned, 23rd of April is mainly seen as England's national St. George's Day. However, this day also stands out as a major moment in Black British history. A moment when nationalist sentiment was supplemented with state racism and police brutality of the deadliest kind. Today marks 45 years since the killing of teacher and anti-racist activist Blair Peach in Southall, West London. quite literally down the road from us. Peach's death and the serious injuries inflicted on others in 1979 were the result of a ruthless display of police violence against Southall's predominantly South Asian community, with whom Peach was protesting in solidarity against the National Front's unwanted and provocative presence in the town. I want to remember the violent events of 1979, not for the sake of remembering, but rather to emphasise that remembering is a political act. Or in other words, to foreground the critical role of historical knowledge in resisting contemporary forms of institutional racism and militarised policing. And since remembering is a political act of resistance, it's perhaps unsurprising that our current political climate is one where denial about the continuing significance of structural racism coincides with a war on remembering. The general line of thought in popular and political discourse is twofold. Firstly, we are told that the police can be proud of its transformation in the years after the Macpherson report and its damning verdict of institutional racism. As repeatedly claimed by the likes of Dame Cressida Dick and Sir Mark Rowley, who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, insist that the idea of systematic racism is inapplicable to policing. And secondly, corresponding our post-racial present, we are told that when we do recall Britain's history, we must do so impartially, so that the blood-soaked skeletons in its closet don't distort the supposed progress we've made. A logic expressed by the much maligned Sewell report. This relationship between post-racial logic and forgetting has major implications for thinking critically about police power and acting radically to resist that power. To deny institutional racism is to render unnecessary, open and honest discussion about the long history of police violence suffered by racialised communities in places like Southall and Britain's death-dealing colonies. To erase that history is to hide the extensive, routine and normalised status of racial police warfare, thereby enabling today's violence to be downplayed as exceptional and aberrational. Put simply, the politics of forgetting correspond what Henry Giroux calls manufactured ignorance. A relationship that conceals the cold, hard fact that policing has always been a state instrument for regulating racialised populations, those enemy others, through militarised measures, ranging from the violating power of stop and search, to the blunt force of a police baton, to the lethal outcomes of armed policing. In the final calculation, radical history necessitates community resistance that refuses unimaginative, piecemeal, liberal reforms, and community resistance that demands something bold and transformative, something that sees an unchangeable punishment sector premised on targeted violence, violation, and warfare replaced by social infrastructure that offers universal safety, security, and welfare. And that's why one of the main responsibilities we have today is to resist the war on memory. Because to think historically is to think and act critically. And to think and act critically is to think and act radically, all in the pursuit of a genuinely anti-racist future. Thank you.
Willett is a creative writer and doctoral researcher at Brunel whose writing focuses on the contemporary LGBTQ+ experience. His work as an LGBTQ+ activist informs his research as he explores the current transgender culture war and its impacts on the LGBTQ+ community. Thomas is also co-founder and co-direct of Equality Amplified, a grassroots entity dedicated to championing LGBTQ+ voices, rights and truth.
Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the LGBTQ+ culture wars, and unsurprisingly, the contemporary culture war is focused around trans people. For me, I was first sort of aware to this battleground when I was researching my topic for my PhD. As mentioned, I was always writing about LGBTQ+ experiences, and I noticed online that gradually there was a lot of animosity facing trans people. And really, this kicked off about 4 or 5 years ago when J.K. Rowling penned her essay on gender and sex issues following Maya Forstater's employment tribunal, where Forstater lost her employment contract when it was not renewed following accusations of transphobia. J.K. Rowling's essay really brought trans people into the mainstream, and people started to question the legitimacy of trans identities as well as their impact on women's rights as well. As Nick mentioned in his presentation, we also around this time saw the Scottish consultation on the draft gender recognition form in order to make trans people obtaining gender recognition certificates easier. So J.K. Rowling's essay, the Maya Forstater's tribunal, this Scottish consultation, the three main sort of themes really came out of these things. One, that trans women were eroding cis women's rights. Two, criminals will exploit particularly the Scottish reform in order to enact abuse. And three, that trans ideology was or is a threat to women and girls. So just concentrating on, underpinning all of these sort of three themes, we find a lot of disinformation and misinformation that's usually fueled by non-experts who come from various different fields and backgrounds, but who are not versed with gender studies, women's studies, trans studies, all part of the LGBT community themselves. So in terms of the first theme, about criminals exploiting sort of the reform, and what we find is that the conflation between criminals who might exploit these new sort of reforms and trans people is that trans people are slowly becoming demonised, and that their identities are being weaponised, and they're being seen as inherently criminal, inherently dangerous, which is being fueled by, as I said, lots of misinformation and false narratives. When you peek behind the curtain, you can see this is not real, it's not true. Other countries who have self-ID, who have more relaxed gender recognition pathways, you'll find that there's been no sort of increase in criminality or exploitation of those routes. But however, the media and sort of our government never really took this evidence into accountability, and then therefore they enacted the Section 35 order, blocking this legislation from passing, even though it was voted through into the Scottish government. So the second theme talking about, the third theme talking about sort of trans ideology as a threat to women and girls. We see a lot of this sort of rhetoric around this is rooted in recycled homophobia, specifically from the Section 28 era, that trans people are groomers, they're grooming your children into gender ideology. They're out there trying to convert your children and convert young people into transgenderism. Again, we see the roots of this rhetoric really from the Section 28 era of Margaret Thatcher. And it's interesting when you look at it because it positions sort of queerness as infectious and deadly. Young people being exposed to an ideology that they can be converted. However, they never really consider that heteronormativity and cis-normativity culture doesn't influence anything in the same way, despite the fact that the majority of us grow up within these systems. So once again, we're seeing how sort of misinformation and disinformation is really playing into the way that trans people are viewed within our culture, and then that's being weaponised in order to make attacks on their rights. So researching this and looking into this online, I do a lot of activist work on Twitter, formerly Twitter, X now. And every time I sort of try to challenge this disinformation online, it was always met by the same people calling me a groomer, calling me a paedophile, sending me death threats. I've had to, unfortunately, engage the police in a couple of serious threats before. And a lot of this sort of rhetoric really has underlying homophobia in it that we can link back to the Section 28 era. Any critique of the sort of anti-trans views is also seen as silencing. People will say you're trying to silence women by standing up for trans people. However, this is sort of misinformation that really doesn't speak to what we're trying to do. We're not trying to silence people. However, this culture war positions sort of trans people and allies as trying to silence the opposition, trying to beat down the opposition, and not willing to let people speak. However, who is actually being truly silenced within this culture war? We see constantly that anti-trans activists are platformed within the media, they're getting book deals, they're on radio shows, they're having audiences with members of parliament, they're influencing policy, they're influencing changes to policy. Trans people and allies in the wider LGBT community are being left out of these conversations. For example, the draft guidance on gender questioning children that came out recently. Kemi Badenoch said that she had spoken to a wide variety of LGBT activist groups and women's rights groups. However, when a request for information was put through, it found out that she hadn't actually consulted with any pro-LGBT activist groups at all. So what we're seeing is trans people and allies are being left out of these conversations. They're not being given the platform within this culture war in order to, one, defend themselves, and two, really demonstrate what it actually means to be trans, what it means to be queer within contemporary culture. Therefore, without these voices, disinformation is rising, and trans people are being demonised and othered and not given sort of a platform in order to challenge that. So, where is this heading? When trans people's rights and LGBT people's rights are started to question, this is really a question on bodily autonomy and what we can do with our bodies. As the trans moral panic has sort of increased, we've seen in America that women's reproductive rights have been put into question, and changes in legislation around the reproductive rights have been enacted. We've also seen that we're being questioned about what education we're giving to young people about LGBTQ plus people, and it being seen as, again, an ideology and something bad and something that's infecting them. So really we're going to see how this culture war has started with trans people, but is slowly emerging and infecting other parts of the wider LGBT community, as well as women as well.
Our final final speaker is Gareth Dale. Gareth Dale is a researcher in political economy at Brunel. His current research focuses on the growth paradigm and the political economy of the environment, particularly technology, fetishism and climate change. His previous interests include the history of East Germany, the political economy of Eastern Europe, social movement theory and international migration.
Thanks, Sarita. It's St. George's Day. I admit to no particular fondness for this saint. With my Welsh parents, slaying dragons was always seen as to be in poor taste. But I do think we should spare a thought for St. George's mother, his mum. In particular, the town that she comes from, which is also the place where her legendary son was executed. The town was in Palestine, a nation upon which St. George's adopted nation declared war in 1917. Then in 1948, its inhabitants, some of them are presumably descendants of St. George's mum, they were killed and driven out by the Zionist terrorists. They were forced to flee to Gaza, where their grandchildren are now being deliberately starved to death under orders from Israel's fascist-filled government. Britain, the land of St. George, supports this genocide. Indeed, it laid tracks towards it by colonising Palestine, then refusing to recognise a future Palestinian sovereignty, even as it recognised the future sovereignty of the other nations it was colonising throughout the region, such as Iraq and Jordan. So, as you can probably guess, I'm averse to nationalism and also to national days. But if England has to have a national day, why not make it something else? What about Shakespeare's birthday? It'd be easy to make the switch, given that Shakespeare had the good grace to be born on April the 23rd, St. George's Day. Now, talking of Shakespeare reminds us of a very basic point about culture wars. They are not new. Shakespeare's own times were full of them. And there have been culture wars over his plays, just to take one example, ever since. One of those culture wars, nearly 2 centuries ago in America, even involved rioting. Then, at the riot, armed cops showed up, and soon dozens of people were dead and over 100 were injured. In the run-up to the riot, in a theatre on Broadway in New York, the audience threw all kinds of offal at the lead actor, including the carcass of a dead sheep. It is very kind and generous of you that you haven't yet been throwing carcasses at me for my crime of meandering around Palestine and Shakespeare instead of my given topic, but I will get to that right now, and I'm going to make 4 very quick points on culture wars and the environment, which is what I was originally asked to speak about. So, point number 1. There are multiple environmental crises, and the most perilous of these are biodiversity loss and climate change. We humans have kicked off the 6th great extinction. We're wiping out hundreds of thousands of species, almost certainly. As to the climate, we're soon going to smash through 1.5, and will plausibly reach 3.5 or higher by the end of this century. At those global average temperature rises, given the feedback loops that will kick in by then and the tipping points crossed, you would be rash to bet on the survival of the human species. So this is a serious issue. Secondly, one reason why the outlook is so grim is the effects of a culture war. It was fought over the question of whether anthropogenic climate change is happening at all. It was a very bizarre war in a sense. I mean, just think about it. No one denies that carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases. Everyone can see that cars and planes and cows are producing colossal quantities of these gases. So to deny anthropogenic climate change, you have to be a, certified moron, or you have to be willfully blind to the facts. Perhaps you're a pseudoscientist in the pay of the oil companies. Perhaps you're a neoliberal economist or an editor in the mainstream media. In fact, up until very recently, the BBC insisted that any climate change story has to report both sides equally, the fact and the fiction, the scientific position and the culture war bullshit. I experienced this firsthand when I appeared a few years ago on Radio 4's Moral Maze programme. It was chaired, back then, and still is chaired, by a climate denier, Michael Burke. Third point. You will hear a lot of talk about net zero transition, but basically next to nothing is being done to mitigate climate change. I'm being provocative a little here, but really very little is being done, and you can measure this. You can see it in the atmospheric measurements, the concentration of greenhouse gases. For all the main ones, their levels are still rising, and for some of them, they are accelerating, despite decades of clamour over the dangers of climate change. That is still happening. Now, in Britain, the culture war on climate change broadly maps to political ideology. The climate deniers are mainly right-wing Tories. Labour supporters tend to be more climate aware. But that doesn't map us completely to action. Look at Labour's record in office, for example. 1997 to 2010, this was a time of extremely intense awareness of global heating. In those 13 years, the proportion of fossil fuels in Britain's energy mix actually rose, despite Ed Miliband being in charge for some of that time, and he's one of the better ones, I do admit that, but it rose. Ultimately, this is all about class, which Nick's introduction introduced us to. 2,000 billionaires in the world own as much as 45% of the world's population. That's nearly 4 billion people. Those 2,000 and the top 1% in general are by far the greatest drivers of climate change. And the political parties around the world just do not dare challenge this class of the population. They just kowtow to them. Fourth and final point, some of the climate culture wars are pretty phony in a sense. I'll put this provocatively again. Some conservatives are climate deniers, but most liberals are climate delayers. They're committed to doing only what is possible within the constraints of profit making. So this means we're seeing some striking contradictions in ideology. Conservative ideology has always carried some sense of protecting existing forms of life, of habitus, and an aversion to experimentation. But conservatives have been pushing by far the greatest experiment in the history of this planet, and experimenting with the planet in the form, through the consequences of the capitalist economic system which they have always supported. Liberal ideology, meanwhile, has always carried some sense of meliorism. The world can be improved. But because of liberalism's fundamental commitment to the market system and to a society geared to capital accumulation, liberalism is driving the planet to utter ruination. So what we're seeing at the moment in the carriers of these two system-carrying ideologies, we're seeing cognitive dissonance on a grand scale as a result of these contradictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of your fascinating, rich takes, and I'm sorry that I felt like I was sort of silencing you a little bit while I was sitting here, but in the interest of time, and also hoping that we can fit in as many questions as possible, I just wanted to try and make sure that we can balance things out. I'd really like to come to Nick, actually, to reflect on what you've heard, but I'm going to kind of steer you a little bit in a direction. I mean, Gareth, you were moving towards talking about elections. Nick, you mentioned that as well. Nick, you talked, I think you used the phrase, to expect mess. You might have said expect utter mess, or maybe I was adding yutter in, I'm not sure. But I wonder whether, given the fact that, as Gareth just said, culture wars are not new, whether we are in a moment where we need to be so pessimistic, in the sense that, I suppose what I'm trying to kind of agitate for here, is this idea of resistance, is this idea that potentially publics are going to be a little bit more savvy when it comes to what issues they vote around. I'm trying to throw that in there as a kind of possible pessimistic, optimistic take on what otherwise seems to be quite a gloomy picture. But yeah, Nick.
Thanks for that impossible to answer question. I think, well, I mean, there's always grounds for hope. I don't know about optimism. There's always grounds there's always grounds for hope because these issues people become more aware of them, and what happens is change carries on. There's no end to change. I think the thing that came to me listening to everyone was the importance of memory. Because, it's like, remember a time when journalists, reported things in a different kind of way. Remember the history of policing, remember Blair Peach and that whole history of kind of institutional racism. Dorian Lawrence was on the news last night. I mean, we just need to remember. That would be the starting point. It's the same with the trans rights. Remember what happened in the 80s over Section 28. I mean, and again, as Gareth was saying, remember Shakespeare. The whole history of kind of cultural wars is an ongoing thing. And with climate change, you can talk about the facts and the figures, but we can remember. I mean, I don't know, it depends how old you are. You can remember the climate has changed. It's changed appreciably in this country. It's very difficult for anyone who certainly if you're my age, to sort of deny that it's just warmer than it used to be. Significantly so, in terms of also, and it's going to affect people in terms of, trying to sleep at night. It becomes humanly difficult when the temperature gets to the temperature it's becoming to get in kind of British summers. So, we just have to go on reminding people is my answer. But I still think there will be quite a lot of mess, as I said, and chaos. So we need courage to stand up to the chaos as well.
Great, okay, yes, and Jazz's sort of terminology around the war on remembering really chimes very much with kind of, I suppose, what we're up against. I want to invite anyone who wants to ask a question to ask a question. Hopefully something's been brewing away whilst everyone's been speaking. There's a question here at the front and then just a little bit behind. We'll start at the front.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Don't work out whether the scenario is going to be the scenario that I'm going to describe, but it's to answer as if it is. If Western governments are going to be faced with lower taxation income and you're facing larger unemployment in society, communities, through automation so far, and that you've got pressures on food supply and everything like that from climate change, do you think that empathy within us will win over the isms, so the racism, the sexual, everything you think of? Or do you, to answer particularly its effect on London and being able to go forward, what direction, how do you see that going?
Okay, was your question directed at anyone in particular in the panel?
Well, each one specialises in a field. Exactly. It'd be nice to hear from each one individually, to be honest.
Who'd like to pick that up? Thomas.
I think speaking from sort of the LGBTQ plus perspective, just on your point about empathy, I think there is a lack of empathy around these topics at the moment in particular. I think when people are talking about trans people at the moment, there's sort of a removal of the person, I think, at the moment. They're just seen as that other. And there is no really empathy around, the struggles they've gone through to get to the point that they're at. I think we need to bring the empathy back. I think we need to bring that sort of humanism back in these conversations. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just going to be that, us and their narrative constantly, without having any sort of empathy in between to try and understand each other. Because, both sides have points that need to be heard. However, I think, that lack of empathy isn't currently helping.
Can I have a go?
You can have a go, Gareth.
You know, go.
I really like this question because I think it gets to the heart of the conjuncture that we're at, which is a very perilous one, and one which will see very extreme political polarization, which is part of what culture wars are about. I mean, the culture wars are different in America and Britain because of the way in which that polarization maps to different institutional structuring of society. So in America, you know, the political polarization along party grounds, Democrats, Republicans, and that maps to different media locations. People look at different TV, read different newspapers. In Britain, everybody, right and left, respects the BBC. So, for example, through that different institutional media landscape, it's a bit different in Britain. But certainly there's polarization, and certainly you're right to suggest that because of environmental crisis and several other different phenomena like demographic crisis and others that I won't go into, we're going to see less money around, basically, and that is going to create this divide, really, political divide over, you know, empathy, greater empathy, what I would see as a sort of caring and left-wing turn in society, or each to his own, and fighting over the increasingly scarce resources that are available.
Which way does it go, though?
Oh, I don't have a crystal ball on that.
Yes.
So I think the concept of empathy is very important, but I want to extend that slightly by also bringing in the concept of solidarity, and also, I suppose, complicating that concept of solidarity a touch. So in my work, one of the questions that I grapple with, both in a scholarship sense, but also in kind of the community work that I do, is looking at the way in which different anti-racist struggles can connect with one another, and the way in which we can fight in a kind of based on common lived experience, right? Inspired by kind of the movements in the 70s and 80s and so forth. I think, given our present moment and given the state of the planet at the moment, that concept of solidarity has to be expanded even further in a way that reinvents our relationship with all forms of life, and in a way in which reinvents our relationship with the planet itself. The Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe calls this the last utopia, our last chance to live equitably and in genuine cohabitation before Earth's irreparable damage, right? And that really requires us to kind of decenter ourselves as the ultimate foremost form of existence. It requires us to situate ourselves as humans with other forms of life and in relationship to other forms of life. And it also requires us to rethink our lives in terms of our patterns of consumption, our patterns of travel, our patterns of relationships with each other, and indeed our coexistence with the world and kind of the totality of life around us. So I think empathy is important, but extending that in terms of solidarity, not solidarity just with each other, but also with life around us, I think.
Oh, I think you're going to get a round of applause there.
Tricky one. I agree with your assessment of the problem going forward. And what worries me also is the way in which these challenges are being represented in terms of scarce resources. Because what often happens when you've got scarcity, you get competition for resources. And the people who need them most get squeezed out. In particular, the migrants that will be fleeing climate change. In those circumstances, it becomes harder, but perhaps all that much more important, to remember who is human and what is human, and what it means to be human. What strikes me across all of these presentations is the loss of a sense of the human. so much emphasis is put on our difference, so much emphasis is put on why we diverge, so much emphasis is put on the other, the them and us. And what worries me watching what's circulating on social media, and I don't think it's just clickbait, I think there's something much more significant happening there, is that in some of those, the othering has moved one step further. And it's moved to a friend versus enemy understanding. We see that in the debates over trans issues. What happened to the human? What happened to the migrant who's crossing the channel in a boat, terrified out of their wits, controlled by the people trafficker or the smuggler? What happens to those people who are sitting, I grew up in South Africa, where my parents lived is now semi-desert. In the space of 10 years, I've seen it gone from a relatively thriving community to practically uninhabitable. Where is the sense of the humans? I think that is our struggle. Our struggle, before we can even get to empathy, is to remember the human. Without understanding and remembering the human, we can't get to the empathy, because all the other stuff gets in the way.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the question that is coming over here. Yes.
It's more of a sharing. I picked out the words empathy, and also alongside that is compassion. There actually is an all-party group called Compassion in Politics, and we show need compassion in politics and policy making. But I'd like to pick up on your point that how the media can distort things before we know things, and it ties in with your acknowledgement of Palestine. I am one of the mob, a convenient acronym that Rishi Sunak has given the peace marches, because we are, many, opposed to bombing. And bombing seems the most immature tantrum of sledgehammering away through a problem, destroying people's lives, spattering people, spattering infrastructures. And it's time we grew up from that immaturity. But the peace marches, to me, have been absolutely amazing. It's been a time of coming together, of sharing with one another, crying with one another because we're so shocked at what we're seeing in the images, supporting one another, hugging one another. People from all over the country, people from all different backgrounds, from all different religions. And our Jewish bloc is getting bigger and bigger. And what I am recognising as a clinician, being a retired nurse and midwife, are signs of grieving. It's like we are grieving the loss of the world that we would like it to be, of peace and love and harmony and coming together and being human and looking after the planet as well. Our planet is crying out for togetherness. So we're wanting shalom, salam, peace, or shanti in the world and togetherness. So the spin-off question for that is, what purpose then, if more of us are wanting that than those that want to divide us, what is the purpose of the ones that want to divide us? Because more of us don't want that peace and love. And the other point from the climate change is I bring this up in Parliament. When will Homo stupidus truly evolve to be Homo sapiens? Because we are destroying our life support system, our one and only planet that we share. And so it is important to renew our compassion and compassion in politics.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Any comments there? Because it seems to me when you were talking about grieving, and you were also talking about sort of nostalgia, which crosses over into a whole other terrain, which is where we probably ended up with, the referendum and all the politics around that, but also some of the St. George's Day, what do we call them today? What do we call them? Protests? Celebrations? I don't know, the violence that happened today in Whitehall. So the idea of belief can also turn into kind of, you know, other spaces and sort of, yeah, seep into darker politics, I would say, as well. But any kind of comments on that in terms of this idea of the human, which obviously is exactly what you're talking about, that connection, that solidarity?
I think, like you, I have been incredibly moved, probably more so than for a long, long time, by the protest movements. And they've given me more hope than I've had for a long time. There is a disconnect, and the price, I think, may well be paid out in elections. You have to see what happens here. It is a tricky one in the coming American election between the Roe v. Wade and the abortion and reproductive issues, that side of it. And on the other side, an awful lot of voters who would have voted Democrat seem to be alienated by Biden's policy. I think, to your point of grieving, we don't deal with grieving. We haven't grieved the COVID deaths. We haven't grieved the loss of the environment. We haven't grieved the people who die in Gaza or in Ukraine, or the Russians living in Russia whose lives have been ruined. We don't know as societies what it is or how to grieve collectively. And I think that's damaging to society. I don't know what the answer is. Yeah, I don't know.
What I'd add to the question of grief is some communities aren't afforded the capacity or the opportunity to grieve. So my work looks at institutional racism in policing and kind of the way in which strategies of warfare play out through police power on Black and Asian communities. And one of the things that I have to grapple with is deaths in custody. And the fact that there isn't still a police officer that's been held to account for a death in custody until last year, I think it was, when the police officer that killed Dalian Atkinson got charged for, I think it was manslaughter. But if you look at, for example, Blair Peach, 1979, 45 years today, in Southall we still call that unfinished business because no police officer has been held to account for that particular deadly act of violence. Therefore, our grief continues. The grief of Celia Stubbs, Blair Peach's partner, continues. So grief and kind of closure and things like that, they're contingent on the politics and kind of the relations of power that generally operate in society on the whole. So I think, again, unsettling that question of grief and who's allowed to grieve, for how long and so forth is, I think, an important thing as well to consider.
I think going to your question about what do people get out of sort of initiating these cultural wars, yeah, from my perspective, we've seen a lot of anti-trans organisations and people make a lot of money from these cultural wars. We've had organisations specifically set up and people are sort of earning money from private donations and they're making this their livelihood in order to try and change trans people's rights. LGBTQ plus people are time poor and they are resource poor. A lot of our organisations are done as a charity and they're done on our spare time. Like the one organisation I've just set up is just me and a friend trying to make some sort of change and trying to bring our voices together in some sort of formal manner. However, I'm not getting paid for this. This is on the side. I have other work to do. But we see that the people who are instigating these cultural wars and writing about them, again, publishing them, they're getting the book deals, they're getting the radio shows. So a lot of it is money fueled, unfortunately. And it's always the minorities that are, the ones who are affected by this, because they're the easy targets, unfortunately. Just as, gay men were in the 80s during the AIDS pandemic, during Section 28, it's trans people now. And the rhetoric is very, very similar between the two. So it's money, unfortunately.
Briefly, yeah, that was a very beautiful contribution, I thought, which I agree with the tenor of very much, as you would imagine, and I'm there on the marches, the peace marches as well, which are utterly unlike the way they're being presented by some sections of the media, I would add. They're very much the experience that you just conveyed or depicted just then. As regards the environment, which is my little issue I've been asked to speak about, I do often wonder why people, for example, why the climate deniers and the climate delayers, what is their interest? Are they participating in some sort of great death drive to destroy the planet, some great tantrum? No, I mean, I often wondered this when Boris Johnson was the MP here, because he was a climate denier for a very long time, and he was an intelligent guy. He's intelligent. It's not a lack of brains that is the reason. He wasn't simply a dupe of the oil companies and so on. But I do think that in the case of climate change, it is very much about the fact that if you are pledged to a form of society which is all about accumulating more and more money and property, that is its basic pulse. And if that is the world you inhabit and the goals that you're committed to, then the threat of climate change and the other related environmental disasters is so great that really some sort of very radical change is going to be necessary if they're going to be dealt with at all, I think. Perhaps involving some economic planning, perhaps involving some different kind of democracy, almost certainly involving a lot of rich people consuming less, involving a shift from private transport to public transport, and these sorts of changes are just seem to be just terrifying for some people, particularly those at the top of society, but they're able to, their fears, they're able to use those fears which can resonate with those with people more widely as well.
I'll give Nick the final word.
Well, just exactly on that point on climate, I mean, in the United States, there's a significant number of the population that believe the second coming will happen before 2050. So if that's your, position, then yeah, in some senses, quite often people who might actually even be concerned about the environment, but it's not their immediate concern because they don't think that's going to happen in that way. I think on the question of, well, the thing that set me off on this was actually looking in bookshops at the shelves, and since 2016 or even before that, if you look at the popular politics, popular social stuff, I mean, you might see a few books by Owen Jones or somebody, but the majority of those books are written from a kind of right-wing, kind of sceptical viewpoint, and there's a huge market for them, and publishers are printing more and more of these things, and there's been a kind of, obviously this is not targeted at the entire public, but there's a certain class of people who are taking this on board. One of the things that's happened since Brexit is, places like the BBC, for example, bought into the idea that they were just metropolitan, elite stuck in their own bubble. There was a recent thing in the Byline Times where an anonymous person said, yes, up to the Director General, we suddenly, believed that. That was what the belief system became. Obviously, it's not true, as I was saying earlier, but people have believed these positions. They become the way things become influential in the media and they have become influential. We now have to live in that kind of world. So yeah, empathy is important, but for empathy, we've got to be able to talk to people. I think there is a chance for empathy in London. One of the questions in this country is just how London speaks to the rest of England, because they're not necessarily on the same page. There's different, as I said, there's different feeling rules, there's different codes of emotion. So you have to sort of start talking, I think by telling stories, you have to sort of actually get down and talk about yourself and then listen to the other person talking about themselves, and it's a long, painful process. And I think it's going to actually have to come partly from people doing it themselves. It's not going to be led by the current political, maybe the Green Party or something, certainly, but even that, as soon as you get more involved in political structures, it becomes much more difficult to do those kind of things. So I think there's a lot that has to happen for empathy to sort of come back. But yeah, I suppose if we all go away and try and talk to some more people that we wouldn't necessarily talk to, that would be a good place to start.
Okay, great. And maybe we can do that over drinks. Thank you so much for your attention and for your focus and for your questions. If you can join me in giving everyone a round of applause. All our speakers.